Today, the war in Yemen is the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. According to the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, 24.1 million people are in need of assistance. 2 million people have been displaced. 360,000 children are suffering from severe acute malnutrition, and an estimated 16,200 civilians have died since March 2015. The conflict in Yemen, one of the deadliest conflicts right now, has its roots in the founding of Yemen. Until the early 1960s, North Yemen was controlled by a monarchy and the British controlled South Yemen, when coups in both regions threw the nation into decades of violence, finally ending in reunification in 1990. The regions reunited under President Ali Abdullah Saleh. Under his rule from 2003 to 2002, Houthis in the north protested marginalization of the local Zaydi Shiite Muslim sect, fighting 6 wars with Saleh's forces and 1 with Saudi Arabia. During the Arab Spring from 2010 to 2012, when pro-democracy revolutions swept through North Africa and the Middle East, Yemeni people took to the streets to protest President Saleh and his 33-year-long rule. Protests turned violent as conflicts escalated between the protesters and the military. These protests, which undermined Saleh's rule and caused splits in the military, allowed al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula to seize territory in East Yemen. Finally, in November of 2012, President Saleh stepped down and power was turned over to Vice President Abdu Rabbu Mansour Hadi. An election followed in February where Hadi was the only candidate. During this time, Hadi started to try to write a more inclusive federal constitution. At the same time, the Houthis, with help from former President Saleh, rapidly advanced south from Sa'd and on September 21, 2014, seized the city Sana'a. The civil war officially began in March 2015. The two sides in this war have been the Houthi rebels versus the Yemeni government, supported by Hadi. The Houthis are backed by Iran, and the Yemeni government is backed by Saudi Arabia and the Saudi-led coalition, who is or has been supported with forces and arms sales by Bahrain, Egypt, France, Germany, Jordan, Kuwait, Morocco, Qatar, Somalia, Sudan, the United Arab Emirates, the United Kingdom, and the United States. The civil war has also allowed al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula to gain a holding in the region. In March 2015, the Houthi rebels and the Yemeni military forces, those who were still loyal to Hadi, faced off and Hadi was forced to relocate the Yemeni capital. In the same month, an Arab military coalition was hastily assembled to support the government of Yemen and was led by Saudi Arabia. The fighting continued and the front line solidified in multiple cities, establishing years of stalemate. In 2018, Saudi-led coalition forces advanced up along the coast of the Red Sea, heading for Hodeidah, the principal port on the Red Sea and the 4th largest city in Yemen. Throughout 2018, fighting in Hodeidah was incredibly violent and brutal. However, in December 2018, Houthi rebels and the Yemeni government met in Sweden to discuss a prisoner swap and take steps closer to peace. The goal of the peace talks was not to negotiate a full end to the war, but to start the process of creating a framework for resolution and to take small steps towards de-escalation. However, peace talks can sometimes escalate the violence, as leading up to them both parties increase the number and fatality of their assaults in an attempt to gain more influence for negotiations. During the peace talks, both sides agreed to withdraw troops from Hodeidah, where 70% of humanitarian aid and imports enters Yemen. While both warring parties agreed to stop fighting in Hodeidah, some experts say that because the peace talks focused there, fighting in other parts of the countries escalated. While the peace talks held a lot of promise in December, by 2019 both sides had violated the ceasefire. In fact, the Houthi rebels committed more than 700 violations according to the Saudi-led coalition and Yemeni government. As the war has expanded, it has dangerous potential to become a proxy war between Shiite Muslim Iran and Sunni Muslim Saudi Arabia. However, the Houthis, who are backed by Iran, have their own interests in Yemen and are not just a proxy. In fact, the United States' support of Saudi Arabia may have pushed the Houthis closer to Iran than they might otherwise be. The Saudi-led coalition, who is responsible for 60 to 75% of the destruction and deaths in Yemen, has been supported by the United States through arms sales, help in choosing targets, and until recently, refueling of Saudi warplanes. Additionally, according to Section 8C of the War Powers Resolution, U.S. support and help for Saudi Arabia counts as an act of war. Not only that, but U.S.-supplied bombs, missiles, and aircraft have been used to kill thousands of civilians as a Saudi-led coalition has targeted hospitals, markets, homes, and even a funeral. Although it's also important to acknowledge the Saudis, the Emiratis, and their allies are not the only ones responsible for the tragedy in Yemen. The Houthis too must be compelled to cease their destructive behavior. One of the biggest ways that the United States supports Saudi Arabia is with information. And while Saudi or Emirati pilots usually pull the triggers in raids on Yemen, the United States provides the warplanes, munitions, and intelligence used in many of those strikes. Another way the U.S. supports the Saudi-led coalition is through arms sales. In 2017 alone, Saudi Arabia bought $3.4 billion worth of U.S. arms. This means that many of the weapons used to kill innocent people in Yemen are made by Americans who in turn profit off of it. Additionally, the leaders of Oxfam Care and the International Rescue Committee, Save the Children, and the Norwegian Refugee Council issued a joint statement that said, "We cannot escape this truth. If it does not cease its support for the Saudi coalition, the United States too will bear responsibility for what may be the largest famine in decades." So, to what extent is the United States' support for the Saudi-led coalition responsible for the war in Yemen? While other countries have also supported Saudi Arabia and contributed to its destruction, the U.S. needs to take responsibility for the many lives lost in this conflict. It is also time to realize that support for the Saudi-led coalition is fueling the war in Yemen. As The Atlantic puts it, Saudi Arabia and its allies are more likely to accept a peace process if it is clear that the United States won't support an open-ended war in Yemen and won't provide the military assistance required to keep the war apparatus going. This is what an American bipartisan resolution that invoked the War Powers Act attempted to do: pull the U.S.'s support from Saudi Arabia in the war in Yemen. However, in April this year, Trump vetoed the measure, and it will be unlikely for Congress to get the votes needed to override his veto. Trump stated that this joint resolution is unnecessary because apart from counterterrorism operations against al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and ISIS, the United States is not engaged in hostilities in or affecting Yemen. Trump also went on to cite Iran and its involvement in the war as a reason to support Saudi Arabia, stating, "The conflict in Yemen represents a cheap and inexpensive way for Iran to cause trouble for the United States and for our ally, Saudi Arabia." While the Houthi rebels and Iran have contributed to the conflict in Yemen, the Saudi-led coalition has created the majority of the destruction. Through its assistance to Saudi Arabia, the U.S. is supporting the murder of innocent civilians, and the only solution is to end support for the Saudi-led coalition.